You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority.
But the state is still formidable. Or is it?
You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society.
Let's dive headfirst into
The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all. Thank you so much for joining today. Today, I want to welcome as my guest, Tyrone the Porcupine Hobo. Tyrone, welcome to The White Pill Box.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Nice to be here.
We'll be talking, folks, about that cool name that Tyrone uses. But first, I want to introduce Tyrone a little. Tyrone is producer and editor of the Haman Nature show. That show's host is the awesome Adam Haman. Plus, Tyrone also co-hosts now and then. Their show, their podcast, Haman Nature, can be found on YouTube, Substack, Rumble, and X. These guys deliver a very engaging and professionally produced show, and I love watching it. Tyrone is a second-generation libertarian born on the day America died. I will also be asking him about that. And I want everyone to be sure to check out Tyrone's info in the show notes. Okay, let's dive in. Porcupine Hobo, the reference to the day America died, second-generation libertarian. Start telling me about all this, Tyrone.
All right. He sounds good. So, yeah, I am a little unusual that I call myself a second-generation libertarian. Now, I'm kind of hopeful that that will no longer be such a unique thing, that that the younger generations, the libertarian movement has expanded, and maybe now there's a whole new second generation of libertarians coming about. But I was born in the 70s on the day America died, which is the day Nixon took us off the gold standard. So,
all right,
I'll explain that a little bit more. But yeah, my dad was born in the early 30s, and he came from a very traditional household. Now, obviously, they were still going through the Great Depression, and he sort of grew up in his teenage years, sort of post World War II, right around then. So my grandfather was a naval officer. He was a doctor on board a ship, served time in the Pacific. So grew up in a very traditional, let's say, conservative Christian household, not political by any means. So I wish my dad was still alive because I'd love to ask him this question again. But I did ask him once. I said, well, Dad, how did you become a libertarian? And I think the way I can remember it best is he just said, well, I was about 14. I found this little book on political philosophy, and they mentioned libertarianism, and seemed like that was kind of who I was, and that was it from then on. And so he joined the military during the 50s, hated it, quit after a couple of years, and just went and got a regular sort of job. But he always had that very independent streak. He didn't like taking orders from anybody. He didn't like being part of the system. So I think he was born a libertarian, so to speak. I think some people just have that instinct in them to be that sort of independent person, right? And so in the 70s, when the Libertarian Party was founded, when it got sort of started, he was right there at the beginning of it, right? Now, we grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. That's where my parents were living at the time. So I was right in the center of all things politics, right? Just growing up. Actually, you could just walk a couple blocks down my house. We live near the Potomac. You could look over and see Washington, D.C. across the river. So I always grew up and sort of surrounded by politics and things, I think, more than most people. But my dad was into politics. Like I said, he loved libertarian philosophy growing up, and when the Libertarian Party got started, he jumped on board right away and helped. I guess you would call him one of the initial members of the Libertarian Party of Maryland at that time. Now, for you young kids out there that maybe think the Libertarian Party is small today. Well, back then, if you got 6 people to show up in some guy's living room, that was a big turnout for the libertarians, right? But my dad, I was exposed to it at a very young age, and I think he started bringing me to libertarian conventions when I was 14, and I think every son kind of wants to be their father. And so my dad was into it, so I would always ask him questions like, well, what is this stuff? And he would give me books. He had just had books on a shelf about libertarianism, and I can't remember the first book I read, to be honest, but I was pretty young, maybe 13, 14 years old. Dad gave me a book, and I was off to the races. I was always sort of a thoughtful child. You know, I was always deep. I wrote a lot of poetry when I was younger, and I was always searching for like deep metaphors and symbols, and philosophy was always appealing to me, even at that age. So let me take a step back, and I promise this will all tie together, folks. This isn't just some boring story about Tyrone's biography. So imagine this, Mark. Okay, so it's 1980. I'm in third grade, I think, something like third or fourth grade, something like that, and it's the big election. It's Carter versus Reagan, right? The first time, right? And for a class project. So remember, I doubt this was done in a lot of schools, but we were right there in Washington, D.C., right? So politics is life in Washington, D.C. And so for a class project, the teacher said, okay, big election's coming up. Do you know what an election is? We talked about that kind of stuff. For a class project, we want everybody to go home and talk to their families. You know, which side do you support? You know, a Republican, Democrat. And then we want you to make, you remember those like poster boards, you know, like those those two-winged poster boards, and you would like paste a sticker on it or a flyer or something. Everybody go home and grab some literature that your family's going to support, and make a like a little display of, you know, what your political view is. Okay, so I go home, tell my parents about it. My dad gets so excited. He lights up, right? He's like, oh yeah, libertarian. So we had like bumpers, and back then everything on the Libertarian Party was branded with a green color. Everything was just this bright green color. And so my poster board had like a libertarian bumper sticker and a poster or whatever, and it's just all green. You know, fold it up, bring it into class. Everybody sets up. Let's say there's 50 kids in the class. There's, you know, 25 boards that are all red on one side of the room, 25 boards that are all blue, and there's little old me, Tyrone, alone with his green libertarian poster board. And I think the teacher asked me, like, what's a libertarian?
Yep,
like,
there you go.
Nobody knew what that was. And so even from a young age, I sort of felt as an outsider a bit, sort of like alone on an island. And that's kind of how I took the moniker Porcupine Hobo, in that, you know, the porcupine is sort of the symbol for libertarianism, and a hobo is just a guy without a home, right? He just sort of travels around. So I always felt like I was ideologically just homeless. I was sort of on my own, and I remember at the time it didn't really bother me as a kid. It's just what I was. I was like, oh, I'm happy to be unique and the only one. But even in high school, you know, it's your friends are Republicans or Democrats. That's the house they grew up in. And my political ideology was so different from everybody else's that I felt isolated in that way. And even today, within libertarian circles, I still feel like my views are a little bit different or unique, maybe a little bit outside the libertarian mainstream. So even among other libertarians, I sometimes feel a little homeless. So I was raised a second-generation libertarian. I was born on the day America died, when Nixon took us off the gold standard. You know, finally, took the last nail out of the coffin on that. Obviously, started earlier with FDR and stuff, but so I like to say, you know, America died on that day. We just didn't know it yet, and it's taken this long, 50-some years, for the effects of that finally, I think, is about to come to fruition. And I think we're looking at some serious times ahead. I know you're a white pill guy. I'm more of a black pill guy, so this should be an interesting conversation.
Should be a match.
So that's kind of the story.
I love that story.
I'm going to shut up for a second.
You know what's so great is that we, the red pill, the ones who had to overcome this belief in statism, have our origin stories. Almost all of us have some story, and it's generally different. So I was curious, like in your case, what it would sound like. Because it would, I would think, well, maybe it's boring because he was just born into it and that was just sort of the norm. But no, even you have an interesting story because your own parent, your own father himself was part of this. And also you happen to live apparently right there where all the politics happens. So, you know, you guys are on the mainstream. And then you have this project that you guys did in school that just so illustrates you're right there with us. Nonetheless, was there ever do you have any memory at all of any point where you had to wake up from sort of some elementary form of statism, or do you just always remember just being libertarian? No. So my dad was very, we'll call it traditional libertarian, and so my original view, my current libertarian philosophy is much different from how I started. So my dad had a clear
dividing line. And I think a recent episode we did on Haman Nature, where we were talking about drawing lines on certain topics, kind of interested you to reach out to me. So my dad had a very clear dividing line between government and private business. Like, he had that solid dividing line. There, today we talk about the regime being more than just the government. It's a partnership of government and corporations and whatever else. But for my dad, it was a strict dividing line. Nope. There's government on this side and everything else on the other side. And so he was what we would call a minarchist, I guess, today. Didn't have that term back then. But so, I mean, he wasn't an anarchist. He was for certain things the government did and against certain things the government did. And so I think he had very sort of conventional libertarian views from that aspect. So for me, really, as I got older, and it really took me a long time, probably not until my late 30s, maybe early 40s, that I really started to understand the anarchist libertarian viewpoint. Now, the funny thing is, when I'd go to the libertarian conventions, even as a young kid, I remember this. Here's a fun story. So I went to the Maryland Libertarian Convention once. I can't remember. I must have been about 16. It might have been the time Ron Paul was running for president under a libertarian ticket, because I met Ron Paul during that time. We went to a media press event that he did on Veterans Day. I think he did it at, can't remember where it was, but I remember, God, this is how pathetic the movement was back then. One reporter showed up to cover it. Right now, here's a guy. He was already a congressman. He's running on the third largest party for president, and one newspaper guy shows up. And I just remember the Ron Paul chief of staff at the time, or whoever it was, like, this is all we're getting. Like, they weren't happy about it. And it's crazy to think that Ron Paul just kept plugging along. But it was cool to meet him in person as a kid. And anyway, so it must have been around that time I went to the Maryland State Convention, and there were some, let me just use the word weirdos. I mean, I think our movement draws sort of those people on the fringes in. And I remember this one guy, he was probably in his early 20s. He's like, hey, kid, you want a fake ID? I know how to get you one. I can make you one. So like, there were just people that are like trying to subvert the system. And I'm a 16-year-old kid, and I'm like, what's going on here? But it was there were some interesting characters back then. But so anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, but my journey's been a long one, and I still feel like my philosophy is evolving a little bit. And there are days where I do swing back and forth between the black pill and the white pill, and I swing back and forth sometimes between the pure anarchist position and some sort of in-between position. So I don't know. If you watch Haman Nature, sometimes I'll say one thing, sometimes I'll say another.
Well, you got me curious.
It's always a search for freedom. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. That's what we should be doing. We should always be intellectually curious. So since you did mention that you think your views might differ from typical libertarianism, spell that out a little bit. Let's see how we compare and contrast.
Yeah. So let me give one clear example. So I know you recently had Stephan Kinsella on your show. I will say I agree with everything Stephan Kinsella says, 100%. I'd say if Stephan Kinsella says it's right, it's right. Point blank. So the reason why I bring that up is the one great example of how I differ from a lot of libertarians is on the intellectual property issue. And so it was a few years ago. So I live in Minnesota now, and I used to be on the executive committee of the Libertarian Party here in Minnesota. I used to help organize and run the conventions. And so one year, I was talking to this was the vice chair of the party. And somehow we got talking on the topic of intellectual property. And I said, oh, I don't believe in intellectual property. I'm against it. And his eyes just went wide. He's like, you are? Like he had never even heard of someone being against intellectual property. That had never even come into his. Now, he's vice chair of the Libertarian Party of Minnesota. He's been in the libertarian movement. So I think a position like that is still a little bit fringe in the libertarian world, or even unknown amongst libertarians. I think most libertarians are not anarchists. I do consider myself to be an anarcho-capitalist or anarcho-libertarian, whatever label you want to put on that. But I don't think most libertarians are anarchists. So I think more and more are coming to that position, but I'd say it's still not the majority viewpoint. So I differ on a couple of those areas like that.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. When you said you differed, I was curious if there was some other aspects that might distinguish you from ANCAP itself, but that makes sense.
Yeah. So there's also one other big difference, and Adam and I will won't say we argue about this, but we have threatened our viewers that we're going to do a debate on this one of these days. But so Adam is a natural rights guy, and I am not. And I think a lot of libertarians have this natural rights philosophical viewpoint that I just think is completely wrong. So I come to libertarian now. So there's another way I sort of changed my viewpoints over time. I used to be a natural rights guy too. You know, that's kind of how I grew up. That's the way my father was. He's like, we all have a right to be free. We all have a right for this. We all have a right for that. And, you know, it's sort of a natural rights theory. And so I believe that for a long time, but eventually came to feel that doesn't make much logical sense. But
yeah. So for me, I also started out pretty much thinking or intuiting, I guess, that natural rights was the best way to arrive at libertarianism and anarchism. I've changed that too. I don't look. I'm not a philosopher or anything close to that. So you know, I'm sure there are folks who can counter what I'm about to say and you know leave me in the dust. I can only go by what my brain is permitting me to think and what my own experience and reading have led me. So it doesn't seem like the natural rights arguments are grounded in objective, hard reality enough. They're more about the shoulds and not the is. And if that gap can't be bridged, then we really are just in the world of opinion. Now, having said that, in a sense, I don't care. Why? Because the natural rights arguments, the utilitarian arguments, they all converge and end up at anarchism. Well, however you get there, right. Their most logical threads take you there. And I'm okay with that. However you get there, I'm okay with that. It's wrong to initiate violence against peaceful people and their property, full stop. How you got there is, you know, great for you, but, you know, I'm okay with it. So I don't even worry too much about that aspect. And then like you, yeah. And then like you, I also always assumed that intellectual property was a valid form of property. But I think we, like most people, kind of grow up with that concept and it's labeled property. The actual word property is the label. When in fact, that's a really misleading term to use. But because it's property and because property is at the core of libertarian ethics and philosophy, we just figured, well, then it's got to be right because, hell, they're calling it property. Kinsella was also one of the inspirations for me to actually shift in that regard, and I too am utterly opposed to IP.
Yeah, it's a great branding, marketing, propagandist term by the monopolists. Property rights. Right. It's intellectual property rights. I mean, let me tell you one story because you said you're not a philosopher, and neither am I by profession. But I did go to college with the idea to get a philosophy degree. I was very passionate about philosophy growing up, and I was probably about 17 or 18. I was still in high school, I'm pretty sure. And my dad said, "Hey, you know, if you're really into philosophy and you know, libertarianism and things like that, you should read Ayn Rand." I said, "Who?" It's like, "Ayn Rand. She's this philosopher, novelist." I said, "Oh, okay, great. Well, my dad says to check it out. I'll check it out, right?" So I devoured everything Rand, and I think as a lot of libertarians do, they go through an objectivist phase, right? And so I became a hardcore objectivist. I even went to objectivist conferences, right? Subscribed to all the newsletters, that type of thing. And so I went to college with the idea to become a philosopher. And it must have been my sophomore year. I was getting into the higher level classes, and the professor kind of wanted to gauge where everybody in the class was coming from philosophically, because we're, you know, for whatever reason. So he goes around the room, you know, what would you consider yourself? And somebody says, let's just say they said I'm a Marxist, or I'm a utilitarian, or whatever they might say, right? Comes around to me, and I say, well, I'm an objectivist. And he openly laughed and sort of scoffed and mocked me in a way, saying, objectivist? I didn't think there were any of you left out there, right? And at that moment, I was like, screw this. This isn't for me. I'm not going to take this. Again, you know, I grew up, you know, fighting ideological battles on my own. I'm not going to do it here in college. So I said, nah, this isn't for me. I dropped out of college and went and got a job, and, you know, just kind of said, I'll make my own way in the world. I don't need this. I can figure it out myself. So
yeah. Awesome. That's so cool. Now, you're a long-termer because it's basically your whole life. So you're able to give us a little bit of a 30,000-foot perspective on the success of the ideas over decades. So give us the very high-level trends you see. And then the question would be, do they tend to black pill you, or do they tend to white pill you, or mix?
Yeah, that's a really great question. But first, before I go even further, I wanted to say this at the beginning, Mark. I just want to really thank you for inviting me onto your show. I'm the first. You're the first person that's reached out to me for an interview, so I'm very excited and honored.
Don't worry. I don't only host heavy hitters like Kinsella and Michael Humer and Adam, the super heavy hitters. No problem. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah. You got to have a porcupine on once in a while.
I need that
to lighten the
desperately.
Mood. Yeah. So trends. So let me tell another story about my dad and something he would say to me. He would say, "Son, there's a lot of hope for the future." And every time I would get down, I'd be like, "Man, this country's going to hell. Man, it's just so bad." So I was a little black pilled back then too as a teenager, because I was like, "What's going on, man? Can't people understand our arguments and see how right we are?" And he said, "Son, look, as bad as you think the world is, or this country is, or it's getting," he said, "we still live in the best country in the world, still the freest country in the world. We still have ideas, and as long as we have that, there's always hope." And what he would also tell me is, he said, every American, or maybe he would say most Americans, are libertarians at heart. They just don't know it. And so I always thought then it was just, then we just got to get our message out. That's all it'll take, because once people see the validity of our arguments and the truth of our economic logic, and they'll just come around magically. 50 years later, or 40 years later, for whatever, I don't really see that trend happening. What I feel like I've come to the opinion is that I think libertarianism, sort of the individualist, independent, free thinkers, I think that is kind of what something like Walter Block said, is we're kind of a fringe piece of humanity. And what I think Walter Block was getting at was that a lot of our personality is determined by genetics, and on a bell curve spectrum, there's going to be sort of, let's say, the crazy people on one end, literally speaking, mental illness, or just never going to fit in with society, right? The antisocial, or sociopaths, whatever you want to call it. On the other end are people who are very sort of independent, and some of those independent people seek power, and some of those independent people seek just freedom, independence. But most people are just sort of in the middle, and they just kind of want to get along, go along to get along type of thing, and they don't really care so much about freedom as an ideal. You take the phrase, "give me liberty or give me death," right? 99.9% of people are not going to trade their life for liberty. I mean, you give them an option. Look, you can live in under a status society, or you can die. They'll say, "Okay, I'll choose to live," and they'll just go along. So I do feel like there's only a small amount, not small amount, but a limited amount of percentage of people that can ever really come around to the libertarian ideals. And at first that really made me sad, but recently I've been thinking about that, and kind of like, I'm not sure that really matters. I think what matters most is money. And now don't make that sound out like I'm a greedy capitalist. Okay. I've said on the Haman Nature show all the time that a corrupt money corrupts the soul, and that's why I said America died on the day I was born, when Nixon took us off the gold standard. I think that a sound money cures basically all ills of a society, and when you corrupt the money, societies just tend to collapse. So I don't think ideas save that. I don't think platforms that we have. It's great that it's great that we have things like the internet and podcasts, because I sometimes think about that little kid today that I was, a teenager, being alone with a libertarian philosophy book in his bedroom, knowing nobody else in the world believed what he believed, and I was really alone. But now that same kid, no matter where he is in the world, can watch this podcast and know that there are other people out there, that he's not alone. So I really love that. But I don't think I don't think we have enough time left in the economic system for, like, I think the internet came a little too late. If the internet came around in the 70s and these ideas had more time to sprout and germinate and grow, I think we could move this country to a more, I'll call it not libertarian, but more freedom focused direction. I just think that it's now been, so that was 1971, Nixon did that. So what is that, 54 years or so? I guess I should know, it's my age. It's been 54 years, and it's been building and building and building and decaying. And I think we are too close to the brink of economic collapse that we can pull back from the ledge. So as Stephan Kinsella would say, I don't know if you mentioned this on the show you did with him or not, but he'll say, look, we're appealing to the remnant, or what Ron Paul would call the remnant. And that is those in society who do love freedom, who want freedom, who are going to be around after the collapse. So I see my mission as to get as much information out there as possible, so that when it comes time to rebuild a new society, hopefully that's the information that takes hold. Kind of like Ayn Rand's hero in Anthem, who finds the light bulb, right, or rediscovers electricity. Right. The knowledge was there, just waiting to be discovered and bring the light back into the world. So that's kind of my hope. So in a way, I'm white-pilled in that I think 40 to 50 years from now, society will turn back to hard, sound money like gold and silver. Society will rebuild into a more libertarian-esque vision, but I do feel like we are, short-term black pill in me says we're going off the cliff pretty soon. So
not too bad, not too bad. I'm going to chip away at some of those black pills if I can. Are you ready?
Sure.
All right, let's start with your bell. Let's start with your bell curve. Your bell curve, to repeat, if I had it right, would have typical bell curve. At one end, you might have sociopaths, people who are just, fringe society, very damaging to society. At the opposite end, the thinkers, the people who can, at least potentially, can think through these issues and have enough critical thinking to where, at least potentially, they could get these principles. And right in the middle is everybody else. Okay. That entire graph is seen through sort of a distorted lens. The graph is accurate, but we are forced to interpret it through a distorted lens. That distorted lens is the distortion that all the people in that entire curve, the entire population, have a right to say something about how things ought to be. Now, by rights, none of them have a right to say how society should be structured at all, not a one. But they do. They vote, or they have some influence over that. And because they have an influence over that, they actually have an influence about how things end up. So right there, we know that statism itself is why the people in the bell curve can actually cause things to get worse, because their bad ideas are amplified by the ability to vote. So I discount that kind of bell curve in that sense. In other words, when eventually we have free societies, that bell curve will look exactly the same way. The people in the middle there will have no idea why this free society works so well that they live in.
Right.
But they'll have no power to ever alter that. For me, that bell curve, as true as it may be, has minimum instructive value because of that. Did that make sense?
It does. So I think you covered this topic really well on the sort of standalone episode you did, sort of analyzing that conversation with Tom Woods and Michael Malice. You kind of make this point, right? That I think you're just making. I would encourage people to watch that episode. So it's a really good episode that you did, really explaining well. And I agree with you, except that as I said, I think we don't have enough time. So as I guess I consider myself to be a Misesian economist, excuse me, from that viewpoint. And one thing that I always like, my biggest gripe about Misesians is they refuse to ever make predictions, right? And I talked to Bob Murphy about this a little bit, because Bob Murphy guest hosts on the Haman Nature show every week, and I said, look, it doesn't matter if you can give me all the economic logic in the world if you can't make a prediction. So, say, for example, Mark, suppose I came to you and said, dude, an asteroid is going to hit the Earth. We got to drop everything. We got to nationalize the entire world's economy. We got to build a gigantic spaceship right now and get it going to blow up the asteroid. And you said, yeah, we got to do that, man. Otherwise, we're all going to die. And you asked me, all right, how much time do we have? When's the asteroid going to come? I say 1,000 years from now. You'd be like, well, screw you. We'll worry about it later, right? So as much as I love the Misesian framework, they're terrible at giving predictions on when things can happen. So, for 50 years, libertarians have been saying the economy is going to collapse. We can't go further into debt. Look at all this debt. Back when Reagan was president, what was the national debt, like $40 billion or something? And now it's 37 trillion, going to be 40 trillion next year very quickly. And so it never seems to collapse. It's like we just keep kicking the can down the road. It's almost like, well, then why are you trying to scare me into thinking that all this stuff is going to destroy the world, all this debt, because it doesn't seem to happen, and you can't tell me when it's going to happen. So here, Mark, on this show, I am going to give an absolute prediction. I'm going to put a year on it. Now, I'm a porcupine, so don't take my word for it, folks, but the porcupine says in 2032, it all collapses. Now, it may not sort of collapse all at once, but it's going to really collapse. And why do I say 2032? Where do I get that date from? Well, I actually get it from the late great Walter Williams. Walter Williams did pass away, right?
Yes, he passed away.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. It was pretty recent. I remember he was guest hosting on the Rush Limbaugh show once, and I just happened to be listening to that episode. And he said, all right, folks, now this was back in the late 90s, I think. So that's been almost 30 years. He said back then in 2032, it's all over because that's when Social Security goes bankrupt. And the Social Security Administration just came out not too long ago and confirmed that it's either now 2032, they might say 2033, somewhere around there. Social Security is done. There will be no more money for it. And at that point, there's only a couple of things that can happen. Either you default on the debt, you issue a new currency, which will just collapse the entire world economy. You jack taxes through the roof. You cut back on benefits. It really is going to get really, really bad. And I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have something like 150 trillion in unfunded liabilities. That's all going to come due at the same time. As the rest of the baby boomers retire here within the next decade. So that's it, man. There's no saving the financial system. There's no way out of it that I can see except one thing. So I'm going to say 2032 is probably when it just all ends. And they can probably string it along for a few years, but I'm not kidding, folks. I think the electric system's going to stop working. You're going to stop having running water. Things are going to get really, really bad because it's all house of cards, and it's going to come collapsing all at once. But I will say this: there is some technological hope on the horizon. And I used to say this about 10 years ago. I said, if we can just survive 20 more years as a species, we don't blow each other up, our societies don't absolutely collapse, I think there's enough technological things on the horizon that could save us. I don't know how much you get into technological stuff, or if you've heard of the CRISPR research, if you're familiar with that gene editing stuff at all.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's some really promising stuff that aging could, if not be reversed, be extremely slowed down very soon. There's a couple of guys out of Harvard that are doing some amazing research right now. They claim that they have reversed aging in mice and that they are years away from being able to do it in humans. If that's true, then we don't need Social Security anymore, and we can avoid that fiscal cliff, right? So there's always a way out of it, but man, when you are throwing a Hail Mary that we're going to reverse aging as the only way to save our society, I don't have a lot of hope. So I guess that's why I'm black-pilled. So I would agree with you, Mark, that I thought if we had more time, because I really feel like these ideas of libertarianism, with all the podcasts that are out there, with all the things that have happened lately in our society, we are shifting the Overton window. We are making inroads. I just don't think there's enough time left. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Very fair, very fair. You almost parallel one of the sort of metaphors I've used throughout my podcast or series or essays, and that's what I've called the race. And it's essentially the race for not just libertarian ideas, but just basically us getting to the point where we're readying ourselves for free society, and the various things that have to happen to get us there, like skepticism of the legitimacy of the state, probably Bitcoin or other kinds of cryptocurrencies really like catching on, which, that is sort of happening right now, and we're on the way there. Anyway, all these different positive trends, racing the state or what it could do to us, which is basically collapse us back to barbarism, or even, a biological contagion of some kind, of nuclear war. So it's a race. Which is going to essentially happen first? Yep. Because, of course, if those terrible outcomes happen, then it's all bets off. If we win the race, or at least get ahead of ourselves in the race for liberty, let's say, then that will essentially squash out any risk the state could offer as the state eventually withers away. So to me, that's a race. And yes, it's a crapshoot as to which is actually going to happen. So I'm with you on that. Now on the point about money, I think you really hit such a good central target there when you talked about money, and how if money were just a basic, we'll say Bitcoin just to use the term, although it may not end up being Bitcoin, some sort of crypto-related, privacy-respecting, trade vehicle. If that happens, then yes, that actually affects the psychology of human beings, because now you're going to tend to look more forward, right? Be more, people will be more of a safer than they tend to be now. Whereas with the fiat money we have, that actually is a psychological impediment for people. So I'm glad you kind of honed in on that, because you can see yourself that there's a psychology at work there.
Yeah. So let me tell another story. So my mother grew up in a small town. She was the granddaughter of immigrants from Bohemia, who came over to America, didn't speak the language. They moved, became to America and became farmers. So then that was my great grandparents, and then my grandparents, they were farmers. My grandfather worked at the mill. They had a small farm, and he died. My grandfather on my mom's side died when I think my mom was just like 8 years old or something like that. So her mom, my grandmother, was left to raise 6 kids by herself. There was no Social Security back then. There was no, government assistant programs. She had to work, a couple of jobs. Well, how did she do it? How was she able to do that? Because there wasn't any inflation. Because a dollar earned kept its value. You could literally just stick your money under your pillow, and it would have the same buying power, years later that it did that day. Because there was no inflation, prices were low. Prices, you could buy enough food for 6 kids, working a couple of random jobs. You can't do that today, because the money has been corrupted. My grandfather used to tell me, well, back in my day, an ice cream cone cost 5 cents. And you say, oh, haha, Grandpa, boy, that's funny, right? Well, why does it not cost 5 cents anymore? Well, it's just inflation. Well, what? Why is there inflation? It's like, why doesn't an ice cream cone cost 5 cents today? Is it harder to make ice cream today than it was back then, 100 years ago? I don't think so. There's more ice cream on the shelf than I've ever seen, and yet it's $6, $7, $9, $10 a pint for like a little thing at the grocery store. What the hell happened? It's because the money, we went off the gold standard in the early 30s. So the gold thing is a complicated issue. We kind of half went off of it during the Hoover administration and things like that, and then finally kind of fully went off of it under Nixon. But even just doing that little bit of a move, creating a Federal Reserve, which at first really wasn't a terrible thing. I know the libertarians are just end the Fed, which I agree with. Don't get me wrong, but when it was founded, this whole Jekyll Island conspiracy thing, okay, fine. But when it was founded, it really wasn't the worst thing in the world. But it morphed under Roosevelt when he took away the powers of the local Federal Reserve banks to set their own local interest rates. You corrupt the money corruption began, and then it got harder and harder to save money. Prices went up and up and up. You couldn't raise a single mother today couldn't raise 6 kids. It wouldn't be possible without government help, right? Without some sort of assistance. And that's because the money has been corrupted. So now what happens? The money's corrupted. You can't survive. You need government help just to eat, to put food on the table, clothes on your back. Well, now you start sucking on the teat of government, and you become addicted to government. You become it corrupts you on the inside. And that spreads through society, and it's like, and today where the younger kids are like, I can't afford anything. I'm never going to be able to buy a home. What's the point of trying to save anything? I come out of college with $200,000 in debt. It's all because our money has been corrupted, and it destroys society from the inside. It rots us from the inside out. But little by little, year after year, generation after generation, it takes time. And so you look back today, and you see a movie, let's say from the 1920s, where people would dress up to go to church or go on an airplane. They'd wear a suit and they would be polite, and men would hold open doors for women, and everyone was, help old ladies across the street. To today, you look around and say, how did we get from there to here in 100 years? I'm telling you, it's because our money's been corrupted. And people look at me like, what does that have to do with anything? How does money affect culture? It's because when you can't save, so Walter Williams, God, I love Walter Williams. I reference him a lot. Walter Williams, you say, what's a dollar? What is a dollar? It's not a thing you use to buy stuff with. It's not this thing to flash around, to buy fancy clothes. It's a certificate of achievement. He said, when you accomplish something, you go to do a job, and your employer hands you over $1, it's a sign that you've achieved something. But if the government just gives you the money, if the government destroys your money, what does it represent anymore? It's almost a slap in the face. You're giving me this certificate of achievement, but I haven't achieved anything. Or you're giving me a certificate of achievement and then sort of snatch it away from me, later. Haha, psych. It's not really worth what you thought it was worth. And what does that do to you mentally? What does that do to you psychologically? Year after year, generation after generation, I feel like it's finally coming to fruition. And we're in I don't even know where we are at culturally anymore. This world is crazy. It's nuts.
I think that's so insightful. And at a bigger picture, it shows how psychology is such a critical area that I think is highly overlooked by the libertarian thinkers. My most recent podcast was with Michael Huemer, and he has talked about this. And even on that show, I expressed how almost frustrating it is that you don't see more thinkers address this. And one of the incredible tangential damage that we see is money and its relation to psychology. The overarching psychology, I think, is that people have in their minds this myth, this belief that certain ruling class people have moral authority over the rest of us. Right there, that's a psychological myth. And that itself is the very causal root of statism. Right there. The myth of political authority is the root of statism. But then that immediately can frustrate us because we say, well, then why for 50 years has the libertarian movement basically ignored the cause of the state? You brought this, you didn't bring this up exactly. You brought up one of the frustrating things in your talk with Adam. You said one of the litmus tests for being a true libertarian or anarchist is, do you hate the state? And that's a great question. But now think about that. Do you hate the end result of some root cause that we're not ever talking about. Yeah, I hate that end result. Yeah, but do you maybe hate the root cause? No, we're never going to talk about that. We're never going to address that. We're never going to strategize around it. We're just going to hate the end result. I want to see my county commission reduce the fees on my permits by 50%. Great. I hope you're successful. But are you striking at the root of statism, the myth of political authority? How to what extent have you pondered the myth as the root cause of the state?
Yeah. So I get a lot of this from David Friedman. So I would say my biggest influences in my current version of libertarianism would be Stephan Kinsella / Hans Hermann Hoppe, but I got to Hans Hermann Hoppe mostly through reading and listening to Stephan Kinsella. So I'm gonna throw them in the same basket, if you will. So I'll say Stephan Kinsella and David Friedman have been my most influential on me within the last 5 to 10 years. So the reason why I brought up David Friedman about that, I think he ponders a lot of those questions very well, especially in his Machinery of Freedom book. But again, I think it does go back to sort of our ancient ancestors. And so David Friedman once gave a talk saying, look, and this is why he sort of did not like Murray Rothbard, because Murray Rothbard would say, do you hate the state? And Friedman would say, no, I don't hate the state. Why? Why don't I hate it? Because it's a thing that evolved from human society as a way for us to survive as a species. So you think about it, we're living in caves, we're a small group. Well, somebody probably just needs to make a decision, right? It's life and death every day. There needs to be a leader. You can't just sit around and have a vote while the lion is coming to attack you in the cave, right? Somebody's got to say, we got to fight. Everybody do this, do that, right? So it's natural for there to be sort of a leadership, a chief, if you will, of the tribe. And then that seems to naturally, as a structure of our species, evolve into a governmental organization. You can see how the line works, right? So David Friedman said, look, I don't hate the state because as a species, it was probably the only way we could survive and build the civilization. It was probably the only tool we had as a species coming, out of the jungle or whatever. If we're going to create a civilization, this was probably how it was going to happen, no matter what. It was just inevitable. So he's like, that's great. It got us to where we are today. So I don't hate it for that. Otherwise, we'd all just be living in small tribes in the jungle, probably. Government got us out of that. Now, he says, I think we are now evolved past that. So we don't need the state anymore. We can dismantle the state and create something different. So he's like, I don't hate the state. I don't like its current form, but I don't hate it because it got us to where we are. And Stephan Kinsella says, now I'm going to misquote him. I'm not even going to try to quote him, but I don't want to put words in his mouth. So I'm going to very paraphrase with the asterisk that this is my interpretation. But one thing I heard Stephan Kinsella say was, anarchy, anarcho-capitalism, whatever you want to call it, will happen naturally as technology gets more powerful. And what he meant by that is, imagine that your house that you live in is now self-powered. You don't need an electric grid. You don't need the water company. And suppose you have in your house one of those replicator machines from Star Trek. So you want some food, you just push a button, and out comes a steak dinner. And suppose you break your leg. Well, in the basement of your house is a robot that can do everything. It can do surgery on you. Suppose somebody tries to break into your house. Your house has a force field on it, right? So you will eventually develop technology to the point where you just don't need government anymore. It'll just sort of wither away because the services that we rely on for the government, let's say defense or, the police or the fire department or the roads, it just won't be necessary anymore because who needs a road when you have a transporter? Like in Star Trek, and who needs a police force when you have your own personal swarm of nanobots that can protect you? So the way to anarchism for Kinsella is not through libertarian philosophy and writing books on economics. It's just developing technology. We will naturally evolve if we're allowed to get that way. Again, if we don't blow ourselves up or whatever, we'll just get there. So Friedman says government was natural to come out from the way we evolved. So he doesn't hate the state. And Kinsella says we will eventually naturally evolve away from the state through an increase in technology. So the root of your myth of political authority just comes from that. It just comes from our nature. Just it's ingrained in us that. And another thing David Friedman says is that government systems, once they're in place, are very stable. It's that thing you said, Mark, where it's just people grew up with the government, they accept it, it's in their psyche, they can't imagine a world without government, and it's just sort of self-sustaining. It's a very stable organism. But David Friedman says he suspects that anarchy will be the same way. Once we get rid of the state and we have this anarcho-capitalist system, that will be very stable as well. And then generations later, people will look back in the history books and say, wow, they used to have this thing called a government. Can you believe that? I can't believe that. So yeah, the mythos of the state, I think, just comes out of the natural course of human experience. I think we're a very young species. You know, I think at best we're maybe pre-adolescent, you know, in our species evolution. So, you know, we're figuring things out. And so, yeah, I don't hate the state. I think we'll get to a different way of organizing our civilizations at some point. But I think, like you said, the middle of the people just sort of, or as I say, go along to get along or whatever. And they'll just go with whatever the system is that's in place. But I don't think there's anything that there's nothing you or I can do, I don't think, that can push that forward necessarily. I think it just happens naturally.
Yeah. What's really cool, and this is even better than it worked out in having you on, because you touched on two factors, psychology and technology. And by the way, under technology, I would include money and the technology for a sound money or crypto or whatever. So more broadly, technology. And you managed to bring up these two factors into the discussion that through all of human history never converged. They never converged. So let me explain what I mean by that. If you ask any libertarian or anarchist, well, we'll say anarchist because libertarians really are more conventional because they tend to be minarchists, like you said. If we ask any anarchist, what do you think will be the rough time frame for a transition to a free society? I think most would probably agree it's not going to be snap of a finger. We're not going to wake up the next morning and we'll be in a free society. That means most would agree it's going to take a while. And if you try to pin them down, they'll probably, more or less agree, a couple of generations, somewhere in there, from the time it kind of kicks off to the time it's pretty much done and mostly worldwide. So what you would have then would be the typical called exponential curve, right? Flat, like forever, a sharp inflection, and then you're up there, right? And it's that inflection point that we would call the transition. And that probably would be, let's say, 2-3 generations from the point where it kicks off. What I find interesting is that the convergence of psychology, which would be just human nature, right? The way we are, the way psychotic people are, the way normal people are, just normal human psychology. Okay, that's sort of a fixed thing. That's our nature. Technology, that's the variable, because that would have to have reached some point where something about it makes statism difficult to sustain itself. Right. Okay, when they converge, we won't talk about when that's going to happen. We'll just say when it does happen. The very early stages of that exponential curve are only going to be a little bit more slanted than the rest of history. In other words, it's going to get a slow start. It's going to be very, almost unnoticeable. The cool thing would be for those who notice the convergence of those two factors, when it happens, they will be the outliers. They'll be sort of like the red-pilled among the red-pilled. That'll say, you know what, I'm seeing the puzzle pieces coming together. And nobody's going to be listening at that point because they're not obvious enough. It'll take being further up the curve to where there won't be an argument about it. So my contention is we have started that curve. We are on the transition to a free society right now. We've started it. But we're so early in that curve that it's hard to see the puzzle pieces together. Technology has converged with psychology in the sense that technology has opened up information flow and made it completely decentralized, almost completely. And that's the factor. So that's where I would say we are.
Yeah. No, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think we live in probably the most exciting time in human history, because I don't know which way it's going to go, man. Like, I think you're absolutely right. We are in a new technological tipping point. So if you want to think about technological tipping points throughout history, right? You could say the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, whatever, right? The Steel Age. You can measure sort of societies along sort of technological advancements, and then the Industrial Revolution. Okay, that changed everything, and we're on the cusp of something else. I don't know exactly what it is, though, to be honest with you. I'm not sure what historians will call this age, like the age of AI. I don't know. That doesn't quite seem right to me. But we are at the beginning of something. But like I said, I'm just concerned we don't have enough time for it to get that acceleration point going. I think you're right. I think like we turned the corner in 1995 when the internet was unleashed upon the world. It's now been a full generation of having the internet. We're in the second generation, the second internet generation. I think we kind of need a third generation, but I'm not sure we can get there. So
yeah, I do think that the technological aspects that you mentioned will follow, but I do think the psychological aspects of it have to mature first, and that readies the second stage of technology, proving that it can replace the government. So when I say that, I mean psychology getting us to the point where there's natural incentives to maybe turn over some government functions over to the private market simply because their budgets are so constrained, or whatever it might be. And other examples might be some of these experiments we're seeing around the world, these regions that are trying out free societies to some extent. When we see examples, well, then entrepreneurs are going to be jumping all over that. But we can't get there until the psychological part, I think, kicks off. And that's where I do think we're seeing evidence of that right now.
That's an interesting idea, and you did just give me a little bit of a white pill hope. Do you see yourself and sort of myself, what we do with our shows, is kind of laying some of that psychological groundwork out there in the ethos, just throwing it out there and let it absorb sort of a little bit into the psychology?
Yes, exactly right. I think there's two aspects to answering that. One is exactly what we do, and to be clear, what libertarians have been trying to do for 50, 60 years now is basically try to talk to people and get them to be more skeptical of the state. Yeah. Just kind of increase that skepticism a little bit. Do we want them to be fully red-pilled? We absolutely do. And when that happens, it's a super bonus. But it's baby steps, sort of like, we have shows, Adam, Bob Murphy, all the rest of them have shows where somebody's listening, and there are newcomers listening, and that gets them to think. And if they're just a skosh more skeptical, hey, you've achieved something. But the other side of that...
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead. No, I want to hear what you have to say.
I want to ask you a question about psychology, because I think I get the impression you've thought about this a lot more than I have. But you also kind of nod your head when I said every libertarian goes down an objectivist sort of wormhole at one point. And some people get themselves out of it, like myself, and some people never do, and that's fine. I learned so much about human psychology reading The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged from Ayn Rand. I really feel like, man, she had such an insight into human psychology. I don't know where she got it from or how she knew it. I was wondering if you agree with that statement and would recommend to libertarians to read some of those books to get an insight into human nature. And if not, or in addition to, where would you recommend, let's say someone for myself, if I wanted to know more about how you think psychology really works in the human species?
Right. That's a great question. So first of all, we were talking about money and psychology. Pick up Atlas Shrugged and go to the chapter on the bum telling about the story of the 20th century motor company. That talks about how communism or socialism failed, but it's got psychology laced through it. Also from Atlas Shrugged is Francisco D'Anconia's speech about money. That's brilliant. And once again, the author, Ayn Rand, laces psychology through there. You could see what money does to you. You explained it very well earlier, what it does to a person when the money is undermined and what it means when it is not, when it's a sound money. So those are good tie-ins, I think, to the psychology of collectivism or money. More broadly speaking, in terms of psychology, you probably want to take a look at Michael Huemer's book, The Problem of Political Authority. He has chapter 6 in there, which covers the psychology of this from the point of view of the common man, of the masses. And then finally, probably the most easily accessible book is Larkin Rose's The Most Dangerous Superstition. You probably have got to read that. That nails it. It's direct.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll sort of assign you that, and then we'll talk again after you've read it, because it's an easy read. It's about that thick. Yeah, it's called Larkin, and I'll link to that. And that really does kind of put your focus on the myth of authority as the root of statism. The problem happens is not in the book, but the problem with people sometimes first hearing about that phrase is they'll tend to take the David Friedman approach and say, yeah, let's figure out what the root of that myth is. In other words, how did it evolve? That's not at all what this is about. This is about how the myth of authority is an ongoing active causal role in the state we have right now. And if it's the causal factor that leads to the state, we should realize that if the myth of authority is undermined or eroding, the state is going to erode automatically. So striking the root is like solving your cancer because you figured out that it was cancer and not put a Band-Aid on it. And that's why a lot of some of the strategists in the libertarian movement have been frustrated that 50 years of effort have attacked the symptom only and not the root. So that's my focus. That's my whole focus. That's everything about my focus. And having dug into it, it's why I'm so white-pilled, because it's led me to some insights that have just been sitting there that say, wait a minute, when you look at it that way, way more puzzle pieces come together. Anyway, that's my little summary.
No, I think libertarians are really great at attacking symptoms. We've got our talking points about why this government program doesn't work or has bad side effects or this or that. But you're starting from the wrong position. So I try to, on my show, Haman Nature, I try to emphasize this to the libertarian audience that's listening to us, is that stop arguing with people. You're automatically in a defensive position. Instead, you should argue, and this is really what I get from David Friedman, which is why I'm such a David Friedman lover and Friedmanite, I guess I'd call myself, is that David Friedman tosses out all of the morality. He tosses out, because he agrees, I think, with you and me, the is-ought gap is unbroachable, can't be done, so forget it. Toss out the non-aggression principle, forget it. It's not about morality, it's about consequences. So he's a consequentialist, and I completely agree with that. So next time you start your conversation with, say, at the Thanksgiving dinner table with your very liberal, cousin or very conservative cousin, whatever side they may be, instead of arguing about this or that policy or like, oh, you're morally wrong about that, start the conversation with, you know what I want? I want a very peaceful and prosperous society where humanity is full of wise, healthy, and happy people. That's what I want. And who would say, no, that's not what I want? That's terrible. I think everybody wants that. Then once we can say, great, we agree that we want a healthy, happy society. I happen to feel that the way to get there is this. That's my belief. And let me explain why. And then I think people are much more willing to listen to you. The problem with libertarians, and I say this all the time on my show, is that they don't know the second part. They know a lot of like abstract philosophy, but if you start the conversation, I want a happy, healthy society, and then your cousin across the table says, yeah, I want that too, but wait a second, your way of going about it is different from mine. Can you explain how your way would get us there? Well, in order to do that, you have to know economic theory. You have to know psychology. You have to know a lot of things. You have to know history. you have to know a lot of stuff. And in order to know a lot of stuff, you have to read some books. And the thing I'm frustrated about with this younger generation of libertarians, they don't read anything. I don't even know how they came to libertarianism, to be honest with you. I think a lot of them are just angry at the world. And they watch a show like Dave Smith or Tom Woods or whomever and like, yeah, I hate the state, right? The state sucks. And they just come with this anger and vitriol. And I'm trying to come at it from a more peaceful and like loving place. Like, hey man, we're all humans. We're all Americans. Can't we agree that we want a great society? Well, then now we're just talking about the actual policies and the thing. But if you don't know why sound money is important or how it works or what money is, if you can't explain that, then you've got nothing. So I always tell my libertarian friends, you guys you got to know the theory inside and out, top to bottom. Otherwise, on the surface it sounds really good, but then if anybody digs in deeper and you've got nothing for them to feed on, to grow on, they're just they might dabble in libertarianism, but then they'll leave quite quickly.
It's so interesting how you honed right to a psychological insight there when you were talking about how you approach people with it, and how libertarians do tend to be very nerdy or academic, and let me teach you economics, let me throw some books at you, and most people are not interested in it. But the approach that you took, whether you intended it or not, factored in the psychology of your listener, and you basically said,
right,
what you did, what I refer to in one of my I have a 23-part Myth of Authority series that I put together, and one of them talks about what I call the true self and the false self. And the true self is the inner anarchist in all of us, the part of us that deals with others day to day with anarchy, meaning we don't have rulers, we don't tell each other what to do, we don't point guns at each other, and we deal with our neighbors through trade or through voluntary consensual agreement. That's anarchy right there, and we all live that way in our private lives, and expect that, by the way. Okay, that's the true self. The false self, that I call it, is the part of us that is indoctrinated, so that we're taught the state is an exception to all that. The state gets to boss people around. We have to obey them. Right. That's basically where the myth lives. In approaching people to try to be persuasive, you do have to talk to the true self, because you're going to get nowhere talking to that indoctrinated self. They're going to put up that wall. But when you talk, or at least start by talking to the true self, you're befriending them. And what you're really doing ultimately is introducing that true self to the false self. You're making their mind see how their private intuitions, which are anarchistic, don't comport with their inner, their inner indoctrinated self. And it's up to them to work that out. That's how we all got red pilled. Those of us who are not like you and who didn't grow up in it, we had to reach a point where we faced that in our own brain and came to the conclusion that, my true self should be a judgment that I apply all over to the state and everything else.
Is that 23-part series? Is that a written series on your Substack?
Oh no, that's on YouTube. Yeah, that's on my YouTube, and that's a playlist that is marked as the Myth of Authority series.
Okay.
I will
definitely check that out.
Sure, and for the folks not familiar, I'll link to that. But we're past the hour, and I definitely have gone way over. But I knew this was going to be fun, Tyrone, but it has been way more fun than that. This has been great. I hope you had as much fun conversing as I did today.
It's been great. I know you had a couple more topics you want to touch on, but yeah, we are running a little bit long, I guess.
So
maybe
let's just save it for later. Yes, that'll be a lot of fun. And you probably want to plug your and Adam show, right?
Yeah. So it's Haman Nature. You can find us hamannature.com or hamannature.substack.com. You can find us on YouTube at Haman Nature, and that's spelled Haman Nature. It's a kind of a play. Adam's real name is Adam Haman, but it's kind of a play on human nature, Haman Nature. We try to explore topics mostly in the libertarian view, but actually we touch on some fun topics. We just talk about movies sometimes, or music, or whatever, some cultural things, always with sort of maybe a little bit of a libertarian twist to it. So we would love it if everybody came in and checked that out. That'd be awesome.
All right, great. That's wonderful. And with that, I think we will wrap things up for today. Tyrone, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to meet you, and I loved our talk.
Super fun.
And remember, everyone, please check out the show notes for Tyrone's info and for Haman Nature info. And as usual, thanks to everyone for joining us today. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.